Dear learner, welcome again in this session. Earlier we had covered part 1 of this session where we could learn what is the meaning and concept of inferential statistics, where we tried to understand the meaning of inferential statistics, how it helps in making research useful and powerful, where we could understand about the sample and population, representative sample, conclusions, inferences, which facilitate the process of inferential learning, inferential statistics. We also tried to understand that what are different inferential procedures in previous session, where we could understand that there are two types of inferential procedures. One is estimation, second one is hypothesis. So briefly we had enough idea in previous session that what actually hypothesis testing is. In current session, which is part 2 of the previous session, we would learn in detail about the procedure of hypothesis testing. As we have basic idea of hypothesis testing, which has been developed in previous session, where we had understanding that what hypothesis is. Like, hypothesis is supposed to be a statement which may be true, may not be true about the population parameter. In that context, we had also discussed about null and alternate hypothesis, where null hypothesis states about no difference between the groups, whereas in alternate hypothesis, difference between the groups is hypothesized. So now, going in detail about hypothesis testing, it is better to understand about the differences between null and alternate hypothesis in detail. So we can name of Salkind, who has discussed in detail about the differences between null and alternate hypothesis. The very first difference which can be observed between null and alternate, that alternate hypothesis is about inequality, where it is stated that a relationship exists between the given two variables. Suppose you are measuring any trait like attitude and you have taken up two groups. So if it is alternate hypothesis, it means the two groups taken for the research or study, they are different in terms of their attitude. So it means there is inequality between two groups. In contrast, what we can see in null hypothesis, it is about the equality, where it is well stated that there is no relationship between the given two variables. So it means if two groups have been taken, the two groups may belong to any of the categories in terms of gender, in terms of stream, in terms of religion or any other variables, and attitude might be taken up as another variable. So if you are taking suppose religion as a variable, so if you are taking two religions, any two religions, so their attitudes can be measured. And if it is null hypothesis, it means there will be found no difference in terms of religion on attitude. And if it is alternate, so hypothesis will be drawn like two religions will differ significantly on attitude. So this way null hypothesis and alternate hypothesis can be differentiated in terms of equality and inequality. Further, if it is elaborated, so the alternate hypothesis is regarding the sample. Means if we are formulating alternate hypothesis, so it is limited to the sample, means it is related basically to the sample. But null hypothesis becomes more broader because it captures the population. So when null hypothesis is formulated, so it covers the population. Another major difference between null hypothesis and alternate hypothesis can be drawn, like the null hypothesis is to be tested indirect, which make inferences about the population based on the sample. Another difference is quite interesting. As we can understand, the alternate hypotheses are usually written using Roman symbols, whereas null hypothesis are written using Greek symbols. So this is a simple difference which is interesting in terms of symbols being used in both of the hypotheses. And another difference which is normal, which can be seen as alternate hypothesis is an explicit hypothesis, whereas the null hypothesis is an implied hypothesis, mainly because it cannot be directly tested. So as we have enough idea about the difference between null and alternate hypothesis, now we should try to understand what are the characteristics of a good hypothesis. Like there is a prefix of good, so it means hypothesis needs to be good to be tested in a better way. Because this is a process of hypothesis testing, so we should have better idea of a good hypothesis, because hypothesis is formulated, and when we are aware that this is good or not good, so we can definitely formulate a better hypothesis. So in terms of characteristics, we can observe that the statement of hypothesis is not stated as a question, but is in a declarative form. You might be not knowing what actual result would be, but you will not formulate question. You will not say like what are the differences between males and females in terms of cognitive abilities. You will either say males and females will not differ significantly on cognitive abilities test. So this becomes a declarative statement. So this way it can be understood that statement regarding hypothesis are in declarative form, means that is a statement which needs to be tested. Another important characteristic is that when we draw or formulate hypothesis, so it should be based upon some theory or literature, means what you have learnt, what you have understanding about the related literature on the topic, that must be reflected in the hypothesis. So the process of hypothesis formulation is based upon theory is supposed to be good. And also, as before formulating any hypothesis, we have ample study about the content and topic of the study. So that way when good hypothesis is formulated, so it clearly states a relationship that is actually expected between the variables, because research is about the study between the variables. So when different variables are being studied, their relationship is being studied, so the knowledge comes from the, so important is about the characteristics of good hypothesis, that it actually narrates the relationship about the variables which is expected from the study. Another important characteristics of a good hypothesis can be understood as it needs to be clear, pointed as well as brief. Means hypothesis would be effective or well and easy to understand when it has been formulated in clear, pointed and in a brief manner. If it is very broader, very lengthy, so it would be not easy to understand what actually hypothesis is about. And one of the most important characteristics of a good hypothesis is that it must be testable. What we can draw from this statement, that it should be testable, because this is a process of hypothesis testing. So if you are taking any statement or declaration which is not easy to testable, so definitely that is of no use from the research point of view. That will definitely a waste of time and resources. So whenever we are formulating hypothesis, we should kept in mind that it must be testable. So from hypothesis testing purposes, there are different important concepts which we need to consider for understanding. One important concept is level of significance, because when hypothesis is tested, so there are different levels of significance which is related to probability, which are used whether their difference lies or not. So from that perspective, level of significance is that probability of chance of observed results up to and below which the probability of the null hypothesis being correct is considered too low and the results of the experiment are considered significant, less than or equal to probability. On the other hand, if probability exceeds, the null hypothesis cannot be rejected because the probability of it being correct is considered quite high, and in such case observed results are not considered significant. The selection of level of significance depends on choice of the researcher. Generally, level of significance is taken to be 5% or 1%, that is 0.05 or 0.01. If null hypothesis is rejected at 0.05 level, it means that the results are considered significant so long as the probability of getting it by mere chance of random sampling works out to be 0.05 or less, p less than 0.05. In other words, the results are considered significant if out of 100 such trials only 5 or less number of items, the observed results may arise from the accidental choice in the particular sample by random sampling. Here we can also understand about two types of hypothesis, one-tail and two-tail test about hypothesis testing. So, depending upon the statement in alternate hypothesis, either one-tail or two-tail test is chosen for knowing the statistical significance. Now, we can try to understand what one-tail and two-tail test is. One-tail test is also known as directional test. It is formulated to find the significance of both the magnitude and the direction of the observed difference between two statistics. Whereas in two-tail test, researcher is interested in testing whether one sample mean is significantly high than the other sample. So, what is important here? One tail is asking about direction. Suppose you had taken two groups and measuring any characteristics. So, one group would be higher or lesser to another group. So, it is suggesting about the direction. And when you are saying that two groups are simply different on any traits or ability, so it is non-directional and as well two-tailed. When it comes to hypothesis testing, we can also find some errors. So, most of the times when experiments or research are performed with random samples instead of the entire population, and inferences drawn from the observed results are generalized over to the entire population. But before drawing inferences about the population, it should be always kept in mind that the observed results might have come due to chance factor. In order to have an accurate or more precise inference, the chance factor should be ruled out. There are two types of errors related to acceptance or rejection of null hypothesis. One is known as type 1 error, another is type 2 error. So, let us know about type 1 error. When the null hypothesis is true, a decision to reject it is an error, and this kind of error is known as type 1 error in statistics. The probability of making a type 1 error is denoted as alpha. The null hypothesis is rejected if the probability of its being correct does not exceed the probability. The higher the chosen level of p for considering the null hypothesis, the greater is the probability of this kind of error. In type 2 error, when null hypothesis is false, a decision to accept it is known as type 2 error. The probability of making a type 2 error is denoted as beta. The lower the chosen level of significance of probability for rejecting the null hypothesis, the higher is the probability of type 2 error. With a lowering of probability, the rejection region as well as the probability of type 1 error declines, and the acceptance region 1 minus p widens correspondingly. So, here in flowchart in tabular form you can see what type 1 and type 2 errors are. When null hypothesis is true and it is being rejected, so chances of type 1 error are there. Whereas, when null hypothesis is false, again it is being rejected, so type 2 error is being happening there. Whereas, well, null hypothesis is false and it's being rejected, so decision is correct. Whereas when null hypothesis is true and it's being rejected, it means incorrect decisions are being taken. Also, one important characteristics in terms of hypothesis testing we can observe, that is the power of a test. How it can be defined? Power of a test is important concept which is related with type 2 error. Power of a test can be explained as a measure of how sensitive the experiment, study or research is in detecting the real effect that the independent variable has on the dependent variable. Because we take different variables in any research. Some of the times we have independent variable and its effect on dependent variable is observed. So, in that context, how hypothesis testing is taken up, power of test is an important tool. So, it mainly involves rejecting the null hypothesis, as when null hypothesis is rejected, it can be said that the independent variable is having an effect on the dependent variable. Thus, the power of a test can also be described in terms of probability related to rejection of null hypothesis when it is false. In terms of formula, it can be presented as power is equal to 1 minus probability of type 2 error. As we know, probability of type 2 error is denoted by beta. So, it can again be described as power is equal to 1 minus beta, or we can also represent it as beta is equal to 1 minus power. So, this way this formula can be presented. And in more detail, what we can see about power of a test, it can also be described as probability of rejecting a null hypothesis that is actually false. So, the power is equal to P, that is rejection of null hypothesis, is equal to 1 minus beta, where P stands for probability. The values of probability ranges from 0.0 to 1. The more is this value, the more the experiment or research will be sensitive in detecting the real effect, and the less is the value, the less is the experiment or research will be sensitive in detecting the real effect. So, in that sense, what we can understand, as we increase the sample size, the power of a test will also increase. So, that is important concept in terms of hypothesis testing. So, before reaching to any conclusion, as we can see that hypothesis testing is a very important procedure in inferential statistics. So, we should learn what are different steps of hypothesis testing, because this is not a one step procedure, but we have to adopt, we have to apply multiple layers of procedures. So, when it comes to steps of hypothesis testing, we can divide it into different steps. So, broadly we can take up 4 steps. As a first step, we can formulate null hypothesis as well as alternate hypothesis. So, this is the important step where it is required to formulate null as well as alternate hypothesis, which are related to the relationship between different variables, and they are formulated in a declarative form, as we have already learned that how and what null hypothesis and alternate hypothesis are. Once you have formulated the null hypothesis and alternate hypothesis as a step 1, you can proceed to the step 2, where you have to decide that what level of significance is to be chosen, because it is an important level where researcher take a call or make a decision whether they are picking or choosing 0.05 level of significance or 0.01 level of significance. It is a custom in psychology or in research or in statistics that 2 important levels of significance are taken, like 0.01 and 0.05 level of probability are taken up for the level of significance. When it is decided that what level of significance is being taken up, third step comes at 4. So, once it is carried out, so based on the parameter specified in null hypothesis, like what population have been taken and how the data will be taken up from the representative sample. So, once parameter has been decided, the data collected on the sample, once that is collected, suitable statistics are applied. And step 3 is important in terms of calculation, because data is there and suitable statistics, as we have also taken different examples while in part 1, where lot of examples were taken and it was narrated that what statistics can be applied. So, suitability of statistics depends what you are applying and what your hypothesis is. So, it basically depends on the parameter chosen. So, once important step 3 is up, the last most important step comes, because inferential statistics is about making inferences and drawing conclusions. So, it is a final and important step where decision is made whether to accept or reject the null hypothesis. So, it is the most important step in that context, because this is a final call of making a decision about the acceptance or rejection of null hypothesis. So, here we could learn in detail about hypothesis testing procedure. So, let us summarize what we have learned under hypothesis testing procedure. As hypothesis testing is an important aspect of inferential statistics, where different types of hypotheses are formulated, we also learnt about the difference between null and alternate hypothesis. Also, we could understand different levels of hypothesis, like type one-tailed and two-tailed hypothesis, which is also known as directional and non-directional hypothesis respectively. The major differences between these kind of hypotheses also helps in formulating and understanding the problems. Also, we could understand what are different characteristics of a good hypothesis. But in the process of hypothesis testing, what are the important concepts like level of significance, different types of hypothesis test, and also we could learn about errors in decision making in hypothesis testing. Also, what is important about hypothesis testing, that was a power of a test. And finally, we could understand that what are different steps while performing hypothesis testing. So, this way it was a learning which can guide us to promote research and doing research in a well organized manner. This way, inferential statistics is a powerful tool of carrying out the research in different fields, whether it is psychology, social science, psychology, sociology, and other important disciplines. So, this way inferential statistics is a very powerful tool to carry out the research. Hope this session was helpful in understanding about inferential statistics and its procedures. Thank you.